Some men vanish to escape their ghosts. Elijah Cross invited his to stay for coffee and left the door unlocked. He'd lived in Brush Hollow for near a dozen winters, and each one seemed longer than the last. Snow still clung to the shaded corners of the prairie like ghosts unwilling to depart. Though the first breath of spring stirred in the light, the ground had started to soften, the thaw loosening frost-bitten roots and cracking the ice along the creek bed. But inside Elijah's cabin, time hadn't moved in years. The medal was still there, buried in the bottom drawer of the dresser he didn't open. Clara had told him once that keeping tokens of war was like keeping teeth knocked out in a fight. What for, she'd said, folding up the blue shawl she wore on baking days. So you can bleed twice for the same wound, he'd laughed. Back then, a rare sound. That laugh hadn't echoed in the cabin for a long time. Elijah's boots made a slow rhythm on the porch as he stepped out that morning. The air was sharp, not as cruel as January, but still cold enough to sting his nose. He held a tin cup of coffee in his gloved hand, though the brew had gone cold. The breeze carried a scent he couldn't name, something like wet stone, something like waiting. The morning passed without word or whistle. He fed the mare, checked the coop wire, refilled the wood box. When the wind picked up in the afternoon, it made the loose shingles rattle like they were trying to speak. He ignored it. He always did. Talk hadn't solved much in his life. He stood by the cedar tree a while, staring at its bare branches. That tree leaned hard to the right, like it had bowed under the weight of something years ago. Clara had loved it, planted wildflowers around its base every spring. They stopped blooming the year she died. No one told the tree, but it must have understood anyway. That evening, the light slanted long and golden across the plains. He sat by the hearth, pipe unlit in his mouth, the fire reduced to coals. The room carried her absence in the softest ways, the way dust settled on the bookshelf, how the second pillow on the bed stayed untouched. He hadn't spoken aloud in weeks, not since muttering to the storekeep in Whistler's Fork. Even that had been little more than a grunt. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not the coyotes who sometimes prowled close when the nights got lean. This was a sound half swallowed, a weight dragging itself over snow, like a creature too tired to cry. Elijah rose with the kind of slow caution that comes from living too long alone. He took the rifle from above the door, though he wasn't sure he meant to use it. He stepped outside, snow crunching beneath his boots. The wind had gone still. The hush lay thick across the land, the way it does before something breaks. He followed the sound to the barn, where the shadow of the cedar stretched long and thin, like a finger pointing at judgment. And there, beneath it, lay a girl. She was curled in on herself, face toward her chest, her hair tangled and wet. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, and blood had seeped into the fabric from shoulder to wrist. Barefoot, barely moving, no older than 20. Though the dirt on her skin and the sharpness in her bones suggested she'd lived through more than her share. Elijah stared a moment longer than a man ought to, not in desire, not in fear, but in disbelief. It had been so long since something unexpected had crossed his path. It felt like waking from a dream you didn't know you were having. He lowered the rifle. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask who she was running from, just knelt, slid one arm under her knees and one around her back, and lifted her with more care than he remembered he had. She weighed less than the ache in his chest, less than the memory of Clara's breath going still one gray November morning. Her skin was cold, but not corpse cold. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. She smelled of river water and pine smoke, something wild, something lost. He carried her inside like a man brinking in a storm. The fire had gone low. He stirred the embers, tossed in more wood, and laid her on the old woven rug near the hearth. The only blanket that didn't still carry Clara's scent was the thin one he kept folded in a crate near the door. He wrapped it around the girl, unsure whether to feel ashamed for offering so little, or grateful he had anything at all. She stirred once as he poured warm water into a basin and rinsed the blood from her arm. Her wound ran deep, jagged, but clean. A blade wound, not an animal bite. That much he could tell. The skin around it was swollen, but not angry, not infected, not yet. He stitched her arm in silence. Fingers steady with an old rhythm, a medic's rhythm from before this cabin, before the war ended and left him half a man. She flinched only once, her eyes fluttering open and half shut again. Words came from her lips. Not English, not Spanish. Something older. Sounded like Comanche, though he hadn't heard that tongue in years. He said nothing. There was no question to ask she'd be ready to answer. When he was done, he stepped outside and rinsed the blood from his hands in the snow. The wind had returned. It moved through the cedar like it was asking questions of the dead. He looked at that tree and wondered, for the first time in a long while, what it meant that he still lived. The moon was climbing, throwing shadows like long ropes across the ground. He turned back to the cabin, and as he crossed the threshold, he paused. It had been 3 winters since someone else's breath warmed that room. She lay still, breathing. Her hand had curled toward the fire. He sat in the old rocking chair across from her and stared into the flames, letting them burn into the back of his eyes. He didn't try to sleep. He didn't ask what came next. He told himself she'd be gone by morning. But morning came, and she remained. She woke before the sun, sat up fast, like a hunted animal, her eyes scanning the room like the walls might collapse. The blanket fell from her shoulders. The bandage held. Elijah had left a piece of cornbread and a slice of jerky on a tin plate beside her. She looked at it like it might be a trap. Then, without a word, she picked it up and ate with sharp, precise movements, chewing only one side of her mouth. He sat at the table with a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm, not watching her, but not ignoring her either. Her eyes finally met his. There was no plea in them, no gratitude, just a truce. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "For now." She didn't answer, but she didn't run. That afternoon, the snow thickened. Elijah broke ice from the trough, fixed a loose board on the barn door, fed the mare. He moved with the slow patience of a man who had forgotten what it meant to hurry. When he returned, she had swept the hearth clean. The blanket was folded. She was watching the cupboards now, the shelves of dry goods. He could see it hunger shaped into silence, a line etched across her cheek, bruising just beneath the eye. He made stew, beans, salt pork, wild onion, let it simmer slow when it was ready. He gave her a bowl and sat across from her. She ate like she'd been taught to eat with care, not quick, not desperate, like food meant something holy. That night, the wind turned cruel. The cabin groaned under it. He gave her the bed and took the chair. "It's warmer," he said. "You're healing, that's all." She didn't answer. In the small hours. He woke to find her standing at the window, staring out at the prairie. Her silhouette was sharp in the firelight. He rose, slow. "You expecting trouble?" he asked. She turned. For the first time, She really looked at him, eyes that had seen more than they should, young, but not naive. She nodded once, and in that stillness, something passed between them, a quiet understanding. Neither was safe, but neither would run, not anymore. She weighed less than a bad memory, and yet carrying her felt like shouldering the whole world again. There's a difference between someone who breaks into your home and someone the wind delivers. The morning sunlight filtered through the frost-fogged glass like a memory he couldn't quite hold. Elijah Cross stood by the hearth, watching the girl sleep near the fire. The light made her skin look pale, like river stone, and the line of her jaw was sharp from hunger or heritage, maybe both. Outside, the wind had softened. Inside, the quiet still held, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt more like the pause between breaths. He remembered the scent from the night before, smoke and river water. Now, as the embers snapped and whispered, it rose again from her skin. There was something familiar in it, something buried deep in the place where old smells and war songs and loss still lived. He hadn't spoken more than a sentence to her, and she had spoken even less. Still, something had shifted in the cabin, even if neither of them had named it. The girl stirred. She sat upright with a jolt, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her breath caught. Elijah didn't move. He didn't want to startle her. He just nodded once, low and careful, like the way you might approach a horse too long in the wild. Her eyes scanned the room, not searching for escape, but inventory. There was no fear, only readiness, a kind of still tension, like she expected the world to demand something of her again, and she had to decide whether to fight or vanish. He gestured toward the table where the coffee sat cooling and a tin plate held the last of the cornbread. She moved cautiously, chewing in silence. Her hand trembled only once. He didn't ask if she was hungry. Some things didn't need asking. Later, while he checked the fence line and knocked the ice from the trough. She stayed inside. When he returned, he found the hearth swept clean, the folded blanket set gently on the bench near the door, and the scent of herbs stirred loose in the room, faint, dry, familiar. She hadn't touched his wife's things. Not exactly, but she'd noticed them. That much was clear. Elijah stood in the middle of the room for a long while. The air felt different now, like the past had shifted an inch to the left. The chair Clara used to sit in hadn't moved. Her shawl still hung on it. But the girl had taken the other one, the plain wool, the one used for guests they never had. It was a small thing, but it told him more than words could have. By evening, he cooked again. This time, he added more to the pot, a twist of wild onion, the last of the pork rind, a handful of beans Clara had dried 2 years back and never used. He stirred slow, watching the girl, watching her movements, her posture, the way her eyes tracked the shelves. She moved like someone who didn't want to take more than was owed, but wouldn't hesitate to take what she needed to survive. They ate in silence. She chewed only on one side again. He noticed, and he didn't ask. But he filed it away, after the meal. She sat by the fire, her eyes watching the flames but not really seeing them. Her hands found the wool again, clutching it, not for warmth, but for anchoring. Elijah sat across the room, pipe in his hand, though he never lit it. He used to think the silence was the weight he carried. Now, he wasn't so sure. Outside, the wind shifted. It climbed, slowly at first, then with a steady rise that spoke of something brewing in the hills. The fire cracked. The girl flinched, just slightly, but didn't turn her head. Elijah leaned forward. "You got a name?" he asked. She said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the wool, then eased. He nodded to himself. "That's all right," he said. "It'll come when it's ready." That night, he gave her the bed again, told himself it was only because of the cold, only because she was still healing. He took the chair and tried not to think about how his back would curse him come morning. He didn't sleep. Not really. The wind howled down from the ridge, hammering against the walls like a thing grieving its own name. Sometime past midnight. The noise pulled him from a restless half-sleep. He opened his eyes and found the fire low. Just embers. But the girl was standing at the window again. The same as before. Her silhouette was outlined by the fading orange glow. Her face was turned toward the horizon, eyes sharp, searching. Elijah rose, joints aching, and stepped closer. "You expecting trouble?" he asked. This time, she turned without flinching, and she looked at him, really looked at him. Her eyes were dark, but not just in color. There was history there, deep as the old mines near Red Rock Post Office. Deeper, maybe. Wounds that hadn't healed, stories that hadn't been told, names that hadn't been said in years. She nodded. Once. He took a breath and let it out through his nose. He'd known trouble in his life, trouble in the trenches, trouble on the trail, trouble wearing a wedding dress and a fever that stole her breath before spring. But this wasn't his trouble. Still, it had come to his doorstep, and somehow, that meant it was his now. He crossed the room and reached for the extra blanket draped over the rocker. He handed it to her without touching her hand. "You'll stay tonight," he said. "We'll figure out the rest come morning." She took the blanket, but she didn't thank him. He hadn't expected her to. What passed between them wasn't gratitude. It was something quieter, something earned. She didn't return to the bed. Instead, she settled on the floor near the fire again, wrapping the blanket tight. He returned to his chair, leaning back with a grunt as the wood creaked under his weight. He watched the fire for a long while. It had burned low, but it held steady. And in that quiet, he remembered something Clara used to say. "Sometimes the fire don't need to roar," she'd tell him. "Sometimes it just needs to stay lit." Elijah looked at the girl, the stranger in his home, who had not stolen anything. Not even warmth. She was already asleep. The wind kept beating at the windows. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like waiting. The wind beat the walls like fists, but inside. It was her stillness that shook him. When the land holds its breath, even the birds forget how to sing. That morning began with an unnatural hush. The kind that made Elijah Cross stop mid-step and turn his ear to the open air. He had risen before sunup, as always, stepping out with his coat pulled tight and a mug of half-warm coffee in his hand. The sky above Brush Hollow had not yet shed its bruised gray, and the snow that still clung to the shadows sparkled with a deceptive calm. But the stillness was wrong. Elijah had lived long enough on the edge of nowhere to know that the land itself sometimes warned a man. If he'd listen. No bird song, no squirrel chatter in the woods, not even the wind through the cracked shutters. Just the hush, thick as wool. He sipped the coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. Set the tin cup down on the fence post, like a man marking the beginning of something he'd rather avoid. Then he saw them. Not clearly. Not yet. Just the shimmer of dust in the distance, a ripple in the horizon that might have been heat, if not for the cold. He narrowed his eyes and waited. The sound came next, a dull, steady thunder that rose through the soles of his boots, hooves, dozens of them. Slow, deliberate, and silent as snowfall. He turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the girl stood near the hearth, her movements calm and measured. He still didn't know her name. She was braiding her hair back, her wounded arm wrapped with fresh linen. Her movements were precise, calm, almost ceremonial. Her eyes met his as soon as he opened the door. She didn't speak. "They're here," he said, and she nodded like she'd known long before he had. He reached for the Winchester above the door frame, his hand pausing just inches from it. Then slowly, deliberately, he let it fall. The rifle would do nothing now. What was coming wasn't a matter of firepower. It was older than guns. They stepped outside together. The snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of slick mud along the path to the barn. The cedar tree stood tall beside it, its bare limbs clawing the pale sky like memory itself. Tahua didn't shy from the sight. She kept her chin up, shoulders squared, and then the riders crested the ridge. They came in silence, 40, maybe more. Paint streaked their faces, feathers tied to the manes and tails of their horses. They rode in formation, not charging, but claiming. The sound of their approach was swallowed by the softened earth, as if even nature respected the gravity of their presence. At their center rode a man Elijah recognized before he'd ever met him. The cloak of black wolf fur, the war paint in lines like tears, the horse adorned in feathers and ash. His face was carved in the way only age, grief, and purpose could do deep-set eyes, unmoved by time. Red Elk, chief, father, not just to Tahua, but to the silence that now surrounded the cabin like a noose. They stopped a dozen yards from the front porch, behind Red Elk. The riders fanned out in a wide circle, forming a ring with Elijah's home at the center. No weapons were drawn, but the message was clear. "You are seen." Tahua stepped forward before Elijah could. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lift her chin in defiance. She simply spoke with the weight of inevitability. "Father," she said. Red Elk said nothing. His gaze slid over her slow, measured, then landed on Elijah. The look he gave was not full of hatred. It was worse. It was full of question. Elijah didn't speak. There was nothing he could say that would explain the truth in a language the chief would accept. So he held the old man's gaze, feet planted in the churned snow, and waited. Long seconds passed. Then Red Elk spoke, low and solemn. "You sheltered her." He paused, then added, "And now the storm that follows her rides behind me." It was not a question. Elijah nodded. The chief dismounted without sound. His boots hit the earth like thunder contained. He walked forward, calm as a preacher, deliberate as a storm. The warriors behind him did not move. Neither did Elijah. Red Elk stopped just paces from the porch. Tahua stepped between them. Her voice was quiet, but every syllable landed with certainty. "I chose not to return." Red Elk did not blink. "You crossed into death," he said to her, "and he gave you breath again." "I took it back myself," she replied. The chief's eyes returned to Elijah, measured, searching, the way one might stare into a canyon, wondering whether to descend or walk away. Slowly, Red Elk lifted a hand not to strike, but to touch his daughter's chin. It was a gesture that carried the weight of something already lost. "You are not a child," he said to her, "and still I hope to decide for you." She didn't flinch. "I did not run from you," she said. "I ran from the men who struck with hands and words and silence." The chief looked past her then, toward the open stretch of prairie behind the house. toward a past tangled with blood and treaty, and too many graves with unmarked names. His voice returned like a mountain waking. "My warriors will not strike today." Elijah heard the unspoken half of the sentence. "But they might return." Red Elk stepped back, the lines in his face unreadable. "You have 3 days," he said. "Then I come not as a father, but as a chief." He mounted with the grace of a man who no longer needed to prove his strength. No cry was given, no threat. The warriors turned with him, their horses moving like the tide pulled by an invisible moon. They disappeared as they had come silently, steadily, swallowed by the snow and distance. Elijah stood in the churned yard long after they were gone. His heart was not racing. It beat slow, deep, heavy. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low again. Tahua stood near it, her hands clenched at her sides, not in fear, in thought. He stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The latch clicked with finality. Neither spoke. But in the stillness, something else was said, something that couldn't be turned back now. "You have 3 days," Red Elk said. "Then I return not as father, but as chief. There are storms that rattle the roof, and storms that sit down across the table from you. The days that followed moved like slow water. Time stretched out thin in Brush Hollow, soft with the false comfort of ordinary tasks. But the weight of what waited on the horizon never left Elijah Cross's chest. It pressed on him like a saddle cinched too tight, reminding him that 3 days had become 2, and now just 1. That morning, the wind came low across the land, full of dust instead of snow. The thaw had finally loosened the grip of winter, but in its place came a sky swollen with silence. The light was gray, and the clouds above looked like they might break open, though not with rain. Elijah woke early. He sat at the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, hands resting on his thighs, staring at the knots in the wooden floor as though they might offer an answer. He heard her moving in the other room, quiet steps, measured and sure. She didn't avoid the creaks in the floorboards like she used to. In the small warmth of the kitchen, she worked without being asked. The morning fire had already been coaxed alive, water boiled, a pot of herbs steeped in silence. When Elijah stepped in, she didn't turn. "They'll want me to return," she said. "Not because I'm daughter to a chief, but because I left without permission." "You don't belong to them," Elijah said. She turned then, her eyes catching the flicker of flame. "That's not how they see it. A woman who is taken, or sheltered, is a woman claimed. They won't ask why you helped me. They'll think they already know." Elijah lowered his gaze, his hands, once steady in battle and on the blade, trembled ever so slightly. "Then we'll tell them. They may not listen." He looked up. "Then we make them." She stared at him then, long enough that something passed between them, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. A different kind of oath, one of soil and choice, not blood and law. She reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. They didn't move for a long time. Later that day, clouds thickened into bruises overhead. Elijah spent hours out in the pasture checking the fence posts, though he'd done it the day before. It wasn't the wire that needed fixing. It was the quiet inside his bones. Inside the cabin, she prepared for what might come. He returned to find the room swept clean again, food packed neatly in cloth, leather reins coiled by the door. She didn't say whether she meant to stay or ride, but her eyes had none of the panic they once carried. Only clarity. That evening, They sat by the hearth. He brought out a long-forgotten parcel wrapped in oilskin fabric from town, blue as the sky over dry Cedar Bluff town before the war came. He'd bought it without reason. But now he placed it before her on the table, like it meant something. She ran her fingers across it. No smile, just a slow nod of understanding. By nightfall, the wind had picked up. They could hear it dragging grit against the cabin walls, whispering in a language even older than hers. Tahua stood by the window, looking out toward the ridge, her arms wrapped around herself, not in fear, but in awareness. "They'll come," she said. Elijah didn't argue. When? Soon. They won't wait past tomorrow. You gave me shelter. That means you took me. In their eyes. I didn't take anything. She looked at him. And for the first time, her mouth bent into the smallest hint of a smile. That's not how this land works. Elijah went to the door, stepped out into the storm. The dust moved in spirals across the yard, soft and wild, like the ghosts of things he'd buried. He stood beneath the awning and stared out at the night. He remembered the grave under the cedar. He remembered a cradle that never got used. And then he remembered this woman inside his home, her presence steady, her voice low but unbroken. He remembered the way she took her place beside him, never asking for permission. When he came back inside, her voice met him like a quiet ember. "I dreamed of a river," she said. "Back home. I was small again. My mother washed my hair in the shallows. I hadn't thought of her in years." He stopped beside the fire, looking down into its glow. "She gone." She nodded. "Winter sickness. No medicine came." His throat worked around the words that didn't want to rise. "You remind me of her," she said. "Not in how you look, but in how you listen. Like every silence is a sentence you're still learning to read." He sat down slowly in the chair opposite her. "You're not what I expected." She met his eyes. "Neither are you." The fire cracked, sending a soft burst of sparks upward. They sat that way a long time, the storm whispering just beyond the walls. In the morning, he found her standing at the edge of the cedar tree, one hand pressed to the trunk. Her eyes were closed. It looked like prayer, or goodbye. He watched from the porch. Something caught in his chest, tight as rope. "You think they'll take you?" he asked as she stepped back toward the cabin. "They'll try. I could leave, ride with you, get you past the ridge. If you run, they'll chase harder. They'll think it was about conquest, not choice. And if I speak, they won't believe you, not at first." He stared at her, at the way the wind tugged strands of hair loose from her braid. "Then what are we?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes dark and full of something neither bitter nor soft. "Maybe we're the language between, but no language saves you when the drums begin." That night, the storm dragged itself across the plains like a wounded beast, restless and full of teeth. They sat near the fire, knees close, shoulders angled toward each other but not touching. The world beyond those walls felt far away, not gone, but distant. He told her then, about the daughter who had no name, about the shallow grave beneath the cedar, about the cradle he never finished carving, and how, for a long time, he believed it meant she had never really lived. Tahua reached for his hand. Her fingers were rougher than Clara's had ever been, but stronger, warmer. "I think she lived," she said, "even if only in your dreams." He wanted to kiss her then, not in hunger, not even in hope, just in recognition. But he didn't. The moment asked only for nearness. They slept in the same room that night. He in the chair, she on the bed. Neither of them truly slept. The air was too full, the quiet too loud, and in the darkness. Her voice came soft across the firelight. "What's your name?" "Elijah," he answered. "Elijah Cross." There was a pause, then her breath, full and steady. "Taura." He tasted it, letting the name settle in his mouth like a word he already knew. Tahura. Outside, the wind shifted, and morning gave way to morning. That night. The wind howled through Brush Hollow, but it wasn't what kept Elijah from sleep. It was what waited in the hills. Some trials begin with a judge, others begin with a deer, a bow, and a man who's already buried too many things. The sun rose slow and watery over Brush Hollow, casting long gold streaks through the cracks in the shuttered cabin. Elijah Cross sat at the edge of his cot, lacing up his cracked boots. Each knot tightened with the kind of quiet resolve that only comes from knowing something has to be done. The morning light made the dust dance in the air, like memories refusing to settle. The day had come. He didn't need to look out the window to know they were already near. Tahua stood by the table, wrapping a strip of dried meat in a cloth square and folding it with care. Her braid was tight, her expression unreadable. She'd been up before dawn, moving with the same calm she'd shown the day they first arrived. Only her eyes betrayed the weight of what was coming. Not fear, but alertness. Readiness. Elijah buckled his coat slowly, stood, and took the bow she had restrung the night before. Its arc felt foreign in his hand, though his fingers curled around the grip like they remembered. No rifle today, no steel. This wasn't that kind of test. Red Elk's condition had been clear: one deer, one path. Not a hunt of flesh, but of measure. Tahua met his eyes as he stepped toward the door. Her gaze lingered longer this time, and he paused with his hand on the latch. "I'll be back by sundown," he said. "You'll come back changed," she replied. Outside. The land stretched out under a heavy sky. Dust clung low, and the air had a metallic scent, like rain that didn't quite arrive. Red Elk waited on horseback at the edge of the tree line, flanked by two silent warriors. They looked less like sentries and more like witnesses. Elijah mounted his mare without a word. The trail that led away from the cabin curved along a ridge of broken stone, winding between ancient pines and dips in the earth where snow still hid in shadows. None of them spoke as they rode. The only sound came from the wind threading through branches and the crunch of hooves on brittle ground. They reached the hunting grounds by mid-morning, an open stretch of brushland, thick with sage and twisted juniper. The sun hovered behind clouds like a watchful eye. Red Elk dismounted and handed Elijah a single arrow. Its shaft was straight, fletched with a white feather, and the tip glinted with flint. Elijah nodded once. No words, no blessing, no threat. The buck appeared after an hour, tall, lean, with velvet peeling from its antlers. It moved with that particular grace found only in creatures who haven't yet learned to fear man. Elijah crouched low, moving through the sage like smoke. The bow creaked as he pulled the string taut, the arrow steady in his grip. He breathed in, and remembered. Not war, not death, but the feel of Clara's hands around his once strong wrists, her voice saying, "Let go when it's time." Eli. He exhaled. The arrow flew. The buck jolted, staggered, then dropped. The shot had landed just behind the shoulder, clean and final, the kind of strike that ended with mercy. Elijah lowered the bow. His hands shook, just slightly, not from guilt, but from knowing what it meant to take something with purpose again. They dressed the deer together without speaking. The two warriors kept watch while Red Elk observed every move Elijah made, not judging, measuring, when the sun tilted westward. They returned to the cabin with the meat packed tight on the backs of the horses. The silence between them had changed. It had gone from tense to something else entirely, something that needed no language. Tahua stood outside the cabin when they returned. Her eyes tracked every movement. Red Elk dismounted first. The other warriors did not. Elijah slid off his mare and stood facing the chief, still holding the bow. The chief studied him in the long silence that followed, the kind that made the wind seem too loud. "You do not speak like us," Red Elk said, his voice low and grounded. "You do not know our words, but your actions say what your mouth does not." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The chief turned to Tahua, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, but realigned. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, "but you are not gone from my heart." He raised 2 fingers to her forehead and touched her lightly, then stepped away. No horn was blown, no battle cry given. Just 3 mounted warriors turning their horses toward the ridge. And then the rain came. It started soft, just a whisper on the wind, and then thickened to a steady fall. The kind of rain that felt like something had broken open in the sky and come clean. Elijah stood in the yard, soaked, but still. Tahua stepped forward and took his hand. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, as they rode back under the first drops of rain. Elijah realized it had never been about winning her. It had been about not failing her. Some stories begin with gunfire. This one began with a door opening. Morning came on the heels of the storm, gentle and unsure, like a child stepping across a creek stone by stone. The rain had washed away the dust, leaving the air sharp with petrichor and the cedar tree slick with memory. A mist lingered across the hollow, curling around fence posts and drifting over the barn roof like breath still not exhaled. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low and steady. Elijah Cross moved quietly, stirring oats over the stove, his hands still remembering their weight in the hunt. Tahua sat at the table, slicing dried apples into thin strips, her fingers deliberate. The light that filtered through the window wasn't golden yet, but it promised to be. There was a silence between them, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something earned, something shared. On the table between them lay the ceremonial blade Red Elk had offered the knife with carvings worn by years of meaning. Elijah had placed it there when they returned the night before, not out of pride, but out of respect. The steel held no blood. It held weight. Tahua touched it once, not to claim it, but to acknowledge it. She had not spoken much since the chief left, but the way she moved around the cabin, the way she swept the hearth and folded the blankets, spoke clearly. She was not preparing to leave. Later that day, Elijah retrieved an old wooden box from beneath the cot. Inside lay strips of carved pine, a faded cloth, and a design sketched on brittle parchment, the cradle he never finished. He sat by the hearth, knees bent, a small chisel in one hand. Tahua stood in the doorway watching him, arms folded, her face unreadable. "You planning to sell it?" she asked, voice light. He looked up, one brow raised, planning to keep it. She didn't smile. Not exactly, but something softened in her. That evening, the sky turned amber. Brush Hollow breathed in golden light, and the wind settled enough for the mare to graze freely along the edge of the clearing. Tahua gathered herbs from the edge of the barn, pinching stems and tying them into bundles with twine. Elijah watched her from the window, the way she crouched in the earth like she belonged to it. When she came back inside, she draped the herbs to dry by the fire and laid her hand on the shawl at the foot of the bed. It was no longer Clara's, not truly. Tahua had stitched a strip of blue into its edge, the same cloth Elijah had brought from town. It was not a replacement. It was something new, born from something old. They shared stew that night, and when the bowl was empty, she placed her spoon down gently and asked, "Will you miss them? My people?" She nodded. Elijah considered. "Some, not all. I miss who I was before they told me what I had to be." He stared into the fire, not realizing his hands had clenched. Tahua stood, crossed the space between them, and placed her fingers on either side of his face. "You never told me what you wanted." He looked up at her, jaw tight. "I wanted peace, but I didn't know what that meant until you walked through my door." She kissed him, then, not with urgency or fear, but with something slow and steady, like a vow made in silence. His hand found the small of her back, her breath met his, and they remained that way for a long time. Two lives no longer exiled from themselves. The days that followed came with their own rhythm. Elijah patched the coop fence. Tahua carved shapes into bone birds, rivers, a sun with 12 rays. They traded little with words, but much with glances, nods, the occasional touch when hands brushed passing a tool or shared a plate. The townsfolk noticed. Whispers ran through Whistler's Fork like wind in chapel rafters, not sharp, but pointed. One morning, Elijah hitched up the wagon and helped Tahua mount. Her shawl was pulled tight, hair braided neatly down her back. They rode in side by side, past the old church and the silent well. Miss Edith Hemley stood stiff at the post outside the store, arms crossed like she meant to hold up the building with her disapproval. "You brought her back then," Edith said. "She's not cargo," Elijah replied. Edith looked to Tahua, then away, jaw tightening. "She's a Comanche," she said, low, as if the word were a sin. "I'm a woman who chose," Tahua answered. The store fell silent. No one argued. They gathered what they needed: flour, lamp oil, sugar in a brown sack, and as Elijah paid, he spoke in a voice firm, but not loud. "We'll be married come spring." A hush deeper than silence fell across the store. Miss Hemley didn't look up from the ledger. Tahua didn't flinch. She turned and walked out into the sun, leaving behind only the scent of sage from the pouch at her waist. Outside, Elijah exhaled not from relief, but from resolve. That had been the storm he feared more than blade or bullet. The storm of judgment, of history. But it hadn't won. They rode home slow, the sun lowering in hues of copper and rust. A hawk circled above them, calling once. Tahua lifted her chin toward the sky, eyes narrowed, but not in pain. They reached the cabin as twilight leaned over the hills. Elijah unsaddled the mare while Tahua walked to the cedar, her fingers brushing the bark as though remembering the day she first lay beneath it. Broken and silent. Now, she stood taller. That night, the hearth burned warm. She sat weaving a thin strip of leather into a loop, her hands working with memory. Elijah watched from his chair, boot resting on the edge of the stone. "Will you miss them?" he asked again. She looked up. "My people." He nodded. She thought for a while. "Some, not all. I miss who I was before they told me what I had to be." He didn't reply. Instead, she crossed to him, kneeling, hands on either side of his weathered face. They didn't speak of wants this time. Only silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. She reached for him not for answers, but for presence. The kiss they shared was quieter than the last, but deeper somehow, like it belonged to both of them now, not just the moment. This time, not for promise, but as if they had already chosen what storm to walk into together. That night, the wind moved through the cedar like a lullaby, and somewhere between sleep and memory, Elijah Cross heard drums faint, distant, but coming. The wind still moves through Brush Hollow the way it always has, slow, steady, carrying the scent of pine and old smoke, whispering through the cedar branches like a hymn too tired to finish its verse. And if you stand still long enough, you might just hear the soft beat of a horse's hooves fading into yesterday, or the rustle of a shawl stitched with blue, or the faint hum of a woman who knew her worth before anyone else did. And when the last light spills over the ridge and settles low on the land, it turns everything gold: the barn, the frost-bit fence posts, even the scars. And it's in that light you remember the quiet ones, the broken ones, the ones who never raised their voices but still managed to change something. Not because they demanded it, but because they endured. And you think of Elijah Cross, not as a hero, but as a man who finally laid his grief down like an old coat, and Tahua, the girl who came in with the storm and left roots where silence used to grow. And maybe you don't remember every word they said, but you remember the look in their eyes, the way she touched the cedar tree like it had listened, the way he carved that cradle like he was shaping a second chance with every stroke. And you remember how the town, stiff with dust and caution, watched from behind curtains and porch rails and slowly, ever so slowly, began to blink, began to nod, began to see. And somewhere in the folds of that silence, a kind of justice settled in, not the kind shouted or stamped, but the kind that lives in the way people leave their doors unlocked again, or how a boy learns to fletch arrows from the woman his father once feared, or how a shawl becomes something new when stitched by choice. And you remember the firelight on the cradle's edge, the shape of bone carved into birds, the hush before the rain, the tracks left behind by horses that did not return for war. And it feels like maybe not everything good has to end in sorrow. And you recall the wildflowers Clara planted that never grew again until one spring. Someone pressed their hands into the dirt and tried anyway. And maybe that's all it takes: a try, a breath. A door opened, and the smell of coffee on the stove when the sun is just beginning to rise. And when you think of Red Elk turning his back to the cabin, not with hatred, but with a heart cracked enough to let go, you realize that forgiveness wears many shapes, some of them lined with fur and silence, some of them wrapped in wedding cloth dyed with storm water. And maybe the greatest stories are not the loudest, but the ones carried in everyday hands, the ones where honor doesn't ride in on a stallion, but sits quietly by a fire, where justice is not a gavel, but a choice made again and again. And when you remember Tahua's words that she was not an arrangement, but a woman who chose you, understand that sometimes the truth doesn't need the whole town to believe it. It just needs one person to keep it alive, to hold it like a lantern in the dark. And if you're listening now, with the sound of old leather creaking and the prairie wind slipping under the door, then maybe you still carry some of that truth. Maybe you still believe that love can come late, but land deep, that the West was never just gunpowder and grit, but also shawls and lullabies and men who stoked fires instead of wars. And if that stirs something in you, regret, peace, or just the ache of something almost lost, then let it. Let it settle. Let it remind you that even in the quietest places, something holy can rise. And if you find yourself looking west at twilight, listening for a story whispered in wind, then maybe, just maybe, you're ready for the next one. So if you believe in late justice, in women who save more than themselves, in cradles carved by men who've buried too much, then leave a sign type 1 if the story still speaks to you. If you'd ride again with folks like these, and follow Westwind Whispers, where the fire's always burning low and slow, and the next tale waits just beyond the ridge, carried in hoofbeats, old letters, and the hush of a town that finally remembered how to listen.